previously, I completed the restoration of the dial on the Breckenridge bracket clock. I removed the thick chrome plating, restored the wax infill, regrained the dial, and then resilvered and waxed the finish with microcrystalline wax to protect it. The next stage of the restoration is to rebuild the movement and put everything back together again into a clock. The first stage of this is for me to refit the mainsprings into the barrels. The mainsprings have been cleaned, and then I have a process that I like to use to lubricate the springs. I've tried many different things over the years to different methods of lubricating the springs, but what I've come down on now that I use mainly is to firstly spray the spring with a PTFE lubricant, a spray lubricant. Then I wipe most of this off again after I've wound the spring into the winder like this. You can just see this sort of wet PTFE just oozing itself out of the coils of the spring in this shot. Then when the spring is wound up into the holder, I can then oil it with a slideway lubricant that I use. It's a high pressure lathe slideway lubricant, and it's designed to be in high friction sliding applications on a lathe slideway, so I thought this would be an ideal lubricant to use on a mainspring. And so far I've found that over the years I've been using it, I've found that it's severely reduced or drastically reduced the clunking and slip sticking effect of grease on mainsprings, and it seems to be a much more efficient lubricant to use and makes the spring quieter in the barrel. So once the spring's in the barrel, I then add a small amount, well, a generous amount actually, of lubrication to the pivots, so that I can wind the spring in without risk of galling the nice new bushing that is in the barrel by winding it with the pivot dry. And removing the holder from the spring is hopefully a straightforward task. Not always. Sometimes this can be a little bit problematic if the spring doesn't want to hook up nicely, but on this occasion it worked out very nicely, and I could unwind the spring back into the barrel, so it's now safely capped in the barrel. Then I always like to wind it a few times at this stage, so that it sort of moves all the oil around a little bit, and then I'll oil it again from the top side of the spring, so it's got the slideway oil from both top and bottom sides. This means that I can be sure that the oil is sort of working its way into the spring from both sides. It often takes a small amount of time for the oil to work everywhere, so sometimes when the clock's on tests, first couple of winds it might clunk a little bit, but it tends to settle down as the oil moves around the barrel. Again, oiling the pivots first. I'm using the red coloured oil is HP 1300 for those who are interested. It's a high pressure, very high quality synthetic oil that I use for the large end of the train, if you like, for the heavy applications. It's important to make sure that the barrel cap goes down nice and tight, but so that it's flat. If it's not sitting down flat, then it can cause the barrel arbor to grip at an angle. So it's important just to make sure that is down flat, and that check that it's got end shake. End shake is a really important factor in any mechanism with pivots. Basically, it has to have a certain amount of movement end to end float movement in order to run freely. Now, this is a very important stage that I like to carry out. I hold the spring barrel and then I wind the spring up fully, and then whilst letting it run down I make sure I've got end shake all the way through the wind. This ensures that the spring is not angling over and dragging on the barrel bottom or barrel cap and killing off the end shake, because this can severely reduce power. With the springs back in the barrels, it's time to brush off the dust residue from drying in grit cobs. All of these parts have been treated with microcrystalline wax, and I like to just make sure there's no residues from anything, any dust and any sort of residues from the wax still on the parts. And the best way I've found of doing this is just to give everything a last brush off before putting it back together again. You can see here the importance of double checking that all of the grit cobs are gone from the parts. The grit cobs are a media that's used in the drying process, so it dries off the white spirit that I use to rinse the parts in. By wicking the liquid away into the cork media that helps to dry. The pegging stage is absolutely critical, and you can't spend too long on this. If you leave any form of debris or dirt of any description in the pivot holes and then put the clock together and oil it, the oil is just going to pick up that dirt and discolour depressingly quickly. So it's best to spend as long a time as you think fit pegging out all the holes. I dip the pegwood in a small amount of isopropanol alcohol, and then this is my sort of final stage is to then peg the holes out a final time with the sort of wet pegwood from dipping it in isopropanol. When putting the fuses together, I have to ensure that the clicks, the pawls, if you like, are sprung correctly, so that the spring is pushing it all the way down. As you can see, it stops up against the inside of the great wheel, but it's important that it's sprung all the way. If it has any kind of freedom to float around without the click spring pushing it all the way back, then that could cause an occasion where it could slip on the ratchet wheel, and that would be disastrous. The line I'm using on this clock is actually a synthetic line. I do often use a harp string, which is a natural gut, on high quality clocks. This is a nice quality clock, but on this occasion it was perfectly sufficient to use this synthetic line. It is not going to damage the clock in any way, and it's a cheaper, much cheaper alternative to the harp string line. A good secure knot is really important, because if this knot was to fail, that's game over for the running of the clock, and it could mean damage to the great wheel and the associated pinion. So putting the ratchet wheel back onto the bottom of the great wheel, I made a little mistake here by picking up the wrong screw, but luckily I noticed my mistake. I noticed that it was just standing a little bit proud, and it's always important to check for things like this. because if that screw was left like that, that would have caused a tightness in the great wheel and really chewed up the inside of the great wheel when winding the clock. So it's important to keep your wits about you, even if you think you've got all the right screws in the right place. Just double check yourself and make sure that everything is doing what it's supposed to be doing and not doing anything that it shouldn't be doing. So I wind a full fusee's worth of line on and then tape it up. And I always make sure I lubricate the areas that are wearing when the clock is being wound. Now these parts are only moving when the clock is being wound, so a lot of the time they get missed. They just don't get oiled. But it's nice to maintain a nice feel when you're winding the clock. You don't want it to feel rough and tight, and also you don't want anything to wear when it doesn't need to wear. So it's good to make sure that all of these parts are correctly lubricated. One of those parts is the pivot of that goes through the great wheel itself. Again, this is only ever rotating when wound, but it's good to have it properly lubricated. And then obviously the face of the ratchet pawl or click needs to be lubricated as it runs into the ratchet wheel. And then this point here is to lubricate the face of the fusee where it wears against the great wheel when being wound. This often gets missed. Again, not somewhere that is necessary in order for the clock to run, but again, it is a wear area that when winding the clock, it's good to make sure that it is lubricated there. In a previous video I made these spacers to make sure that the end shake of the freedom of the great wheel against the fusee was correct, because it's important that the great wheel doesn't flap around, because that can have effects on the depthing, or even with the great wheel catching other wheels further down the train. So it's important just to make sure that the great wheel is free to rotate, so it is not tight whilst winding, and so that the ratchet can operate properly, but it shouldn't really flap around. So I have to make sure that that tolerance is correct. Now it comes to building up the sort of power end of the clock. The mainsprings are obviously in the barrels, and the line is wound onto the fusees. So the other end of the line comes round and is knotted into the barrel to link the two parts of the power part of the mechanism together. The next stage after assembling the movement is to check that the strike is all set up properly. I'm looking here for the hammer to rest there, not being on a pin. So it's just dropped off a pin and is resting nicely. So it's not going to risk being lifting on the warning, and it's not going to hold the hammer at the end. Also, I need to check that the worn is of a suitable amount so that it doesn't lift the hammer, but so that it's enough to move the train on. I then replace the sort of rough taper pins that I use to just assemble the clock with much neater pins that are all trimmed to length and nicely domed off at both ends. I like to try and make the pins look as tidy as possible. It's just a sort of little bit of pride in work. I hate seeing sort of chewed up, nasty, tapered pins clipped off. I like the pins to be neat and tidy, and if possible, nice and sort of equal, pushed into both sides of the pillar. Now here, this is a 5-pillar bracket clock, and the central pillar, it's very important that that pin is in tight when working on the clock, when doing the bushing work, because when you drive that home when assembling the clock now, that can sometimes tighten up the train. So this stage now is to check that for about the 10th time during assembly, just that everything is as it should be. But this is a particularly important stage to check that the end shakes are all present on all the wheels through the train. Now that I'm satisfied that the clock is set up properly, I can spend the time running the line onto the barrels. There are other ways of doing this, but on some clocks this is the only way, is just to let the train run it through. Now a very important stage is to check that the fly, that the strike train is able to run in all situations. So you can see here I'm stopping the fly through the duration of the lift of the hammer to make sure that it's still capable of picking up again, so the train can restart itself in any situation. That way I'm sure that it's not going to be in a position where it could stall. And finally, with the line set up on the barrel, I relax the spring to the point where it's just about to let the line move, but I don't actually want it to let the line move, just enough to keep it on. And then give it the setup. Now the amount of setup is different clock on clock and spring on spring, but a good starting point is about 1/4 of a turn when the clock is completely wound down. Now with the clock assembled, it's possible to see that the pendulum is quite sloppy on the crutch. The slot in the pendulum is very wide open. This is actually a replacement pendulum. You can see they've made a bit of a hash of chopping the slot out and then closing it up by bending it. So what I'm doing is to chop some shim stock, some brass shim stock, which I then want to soft solder into the slot. This is after opening the slot up slightly and straightening it all up. So then, with it all oversized, I can file it down neatly. I'm not too worried about this pendulum. It's not original to the clock. It's a fairly modern replacement pendulum. The pendulum's obviously been lost at some stage in this clock's life. So I'm not too worried about sort of invasive work on this component. I would perhaps be a little bit gentler on on how invasive I was being with an original component. So then, with the brass shim stock trimmed down to the thickness of the pendulum rod, I can then open up the slot and file it to a nice parallel smooth slot before checking to see how the tolerance is with the crutch pin. This is a trial and error method. I mean, you could do it with measurement, but if you try and measure this and work to a dimension, you're almost certainly going to overshoot. So it's the kind of thing where there's a lot in clockmaking that has to be done by feel. Clockmaking is a trade that's worked on by touch. So when I was closing in on it, it's just very small amounts that are needed from this stage, just to finish it off and get it to the right size. The slot is then cleaned up and burnished to give it a nice smooth surface. The crutch itself was not in great condition and was slipping far too freely. It had already been beaten up quite a few times, so it was difficult to tighten up. So I wanted to make sure that the clock wasn't in a position where it could put itself out of beat. So what I did was to remove the crutch from the pallet arbor and then turn the pallet arbor back a little bit, the collet for the crutch back a little bit, and that enabled me to have a little bit of meat left on the collet to rivet over to hold the crutch in position. Put the crutch back together loosely in the clock, and then for initial assembly I just put some thread lock. So this isn't the strongest Loctite. This is a Loctite that can move or can be made to move, and just put a small amount on to hold the crutch in position. So after allowing that to bite and just enough to hold the crutch in position, I then was able to make the adjustments. Now I need the adjustments to be pretty good before I rivet up the end of the crutch. I'm not going to rivet it so that it's solid. I'm still going to have it so that it will slip, but not enough to slip easily under normal work. Setting the clock in beat is a very important thing that needs to be done. Clocks will sometimes run favouring one side of the beat, but if you want to get optimum performance out of a clock, it's important to get it in beat. And some clocks just won't work if they're not in beat. The split anvils or split blocks are incredibly useful for jobs exactly like this, where you can't put the whole part straight through a hole in order to support it, but you can then build the support either side of it with the split anvil. I wanted to make sure that the brass collet was peened over nicely, but again not so hard that it couldn't be moved. This is where the Loctite that I put on earlier came into its own to hold the whole assembly in the adjustment that I just made. Otherwise, it would have all slipped around all over the place and been. I'd have been starting from square one trying to set the clock in beat. With the dial now refitted, the only thing that remained is to remove the pin holding in the hand collet and to shorten it and dome off the ends. It's always nice to complete the job with a decent looking pin right where you're going to look at it the most, on the front of the clock. I hate seeing pins that are either left way too long, uneven, or just snipped off messily without taking this little bit of extra attention to detail and making a really nice job of it. Looks so much better. Looks like some care has been made for the job. So then it's back into the case with the movement.